Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Dan. I am the test prep director here at Ruth Rumex Learning Space. Let me actually just change my name so I am who I say I am. So welcome. Thanks for being here this evening. We are talking about applying to American universities and the SAT/ACT and all of the stuff that goes into preparing for that test, as well as sort of the weird changes that are happening right now with some of the schools not requiring it for the near future or ever again, like the University of California suite of schools. So I'll definitely have some time to answer some of those questions about those particular things. But my goal tonight is basically to walk everybody through what the tests are all about. Just give some general information on how preparation works for them, sort of talk about a little bit about like what makes them so challenging as opposed to like your sort of standard grade 11 or grade 12 school exam. And then we'll have some time for questions. So the webinar is booked for 7 to 8. My goal is to get through the bulk of talking about it by 7:30. If you don't have any questions, you are free to go on your way after 30 minutes. And if you'd like to stick around and talk and ask some more specific questions about your unique situation or or anything like that, I'll be here to answer those questions. So let's get started. Basically, okay, one thing I will just mention right up front, this is a similar, I make some changes year to year, but I am leaving things crossed off over the past year or so when I give these presentations, because I just want to draw attention to what has changed over the last couple of years, so that it's sort of a visual to see what's going on here. So just basically the ACT and the SAT. It's the American College Test and the Scholastic Aptitude Test. Both of these tests are written by grade 11 or 12 students, and they're used for college admissions. There is absolutely no difference in their value in terms of how schools see them. There's no difference in terms of which one certain schools prefer. Any student can take either of these tests for any school that requires a test for entrance. So the main differences between them I'll talk about in a few minutes, but basically, the big thing in terms of historical differences, the SAT has historically been an East Coast test. The ACT has historically been a West Coast test. Most schools, or most students rather, who grew up in the East Coast, so I myself grew up in the New York City metro area, in the suburbs of New York. I had not even heard of the ACT until I had already studied for and taken my SAT. And it's just because, the geographics of where students are in the States sort of makes a difference. I assume now, like I'm getting older, I assume now, like with, with more kids being online and things like that, there's a lot more exposure to both tests. But back when I was a kid and had to go to the public library to get online, ACT was not something that even crossed our minds. So the SAT 2 subject tests are done for. They're no longer used as of 2021. Those were additional tests on top of the SAT that students used to take for certain school admissions, depending on the actual program that they were going into. The PSAT is still around. Some people call it the practice SAT. It's actually the pre-SAT. It is administered by the same people who do the SAT. It's written by students in grades 9 to 11. Students even as young as grade 8 can write it, but usually it's written by grade 9 or 10 students. For some kids, it's practicing for the SAT, although it's not really any different in terms of its difficulty. It's a bit shorter. But kids use it for the National Merit Scholarship qualifying, or it's the NMSQT is the National Merit Scholarship qualifying test. So students will use it to qualify for scholarships in the US for certain kinds of scholarships. But we don't really prepare for that in Canada, because unless you are unless you're a resident of the United States, you wouldn't qualify for the National Merit Scholarship. So it's given to a certain number of students in each state. So even if you're an American citizen living out of the country, it doesn't, it wouldn't really have any value. It's still used in a few cases in Canada, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to focus on the big two, the ACT and the SAT. Well, here we go. PSAT is first. It's not easier. It has a different scoring scheme, and there's fewer questions per section. There's no essay, but there's no essay on the SAT anymore either. So, so that's a difference. That's no longer a difference. The SAT and the ACT, like I said, both schools will take either. There's a lot of schools that are test optional right now. But really, both tests look at exactly the same thing, with the exception of the science section on the ACT. There is no science section on the SAT, but it's a bit of a misnomer in a way. It's not actually testing students on their knowledge of science necessarily. There are some questions on the ACT that are specific knowledge in terms of high school science, but most 90, 95, I would even venture to say, % of the science test on the ACT is really just reading comprehension with a science theme. So you'll be given a research document to look at, or a couple of paragraphs of a scientific research article, and you'll be asked comprehension questions about it, and sometimes asked to sort of decipher a chart or things like that. The SAT does not require an essay at all anymore. The ACT still does have an optional essay. So let's talk about the optional testing situation in the States right now. Basically, the University of California schools are no longer using the test at all. According to them, they will no longer take it in the future either. Other schools, namely Harvard, have gone test optional. So let's just talk a little bit about what those terms mean and what the implications are. So some schools are test blind, means that if you send it in, they're not going to look at it no matter what. Even if you say to them, I really want you to see how well I did, I scored a perfect SAT, they will not take that into consideration, even if you submit it to them. And with online applications, there is no way to submit that to them through their application. You'd have to send it in separately, but it wouldn't matter. So that's a school like Harvard right now. Not a school like Harvard. A school like Harvard is test optional. Test blind schools are fewer and further between, but that would be a school like the University of California schools. The test optional schools, so that's a school like Harvard, they will look at your score if you submit it, but you don't have to submit a score for your application. And then obviously the traditional test required schools, that's the bulk of the schools in the United States. Still, you must submit either an SAT or ACT score. So the first thing that I just want to point out about test optional, and this is more, obviously for some kids, this is a huge weight off their shoulders to not have to submit their test scores. In the US, many of the students who are affected by that are not necessarily looking at the kind of schools that families in Canada are looking at sending their kids to. A lot of the people who are benefiting from test optional are really looking at smaller state schools, schools with a little less prestige, schools that would never have required them to begin with to get a particularly high score on either the ACT or the SAT. If we look at a school like Harvard, where the publicity around going test optional has really, it's put a lot of emphasis on the equity of the school and things like that. In practice, on paper, it sounds quite nice, but in practice, what actually happens is, so two things. Number one is there's an influx of students who will apply to that school where they would traditionally not have even bothered to apply because their scores would not have gained them access. So that influx of students, let's say that there's, even a small number, 5% higher submission of applications. What actually happens is that Harvard doesn't open any additional seats for new students to take that into account. So the school itself, in presenting this, does themselves a service, but what actually happens is they become even more prestigious and more selective in terms of the number of, or which students they're actually accepting. So if there's a 5% influx of new students applying, then it's 5% more difficult to get into that school than it was the previous year. So it actually works in their benefit in a lot of ways. And, a student with a really strong report card would have inevitably, written the SAT anyway in most cases. So it wouldn't necessarily have affected that student like it would have affected a student who has sort of a mediocre report card, who knows that their SAT score may not have been high enough to get them into the school, to this sort of caliber of schools. So that's the main thing that I'll say about test optional. And like I said, at the end of this presentation, I'm happy to answer some more questions in terms of what some of the bigger implications of that are. But just moving on, looking at the SAT versus the ACT. So one of the big questions that families will start off with is by saying, like, which test should my kid do? I really don't know. Without the essay, the ACT and the SAT are basically the same length. They're about 3 hours long. They have the same sections with the exception of science. Like I said, the reading section on both the SAT and the ACT is just looking at reading comprehension. The English section on the ACT is the same as the writing and language section on the SAT. So, those are really looking at the conventions of English language, looking specifically about grammar. You're basically playing the role of an editor during those sections, and I'll give you some examples of those. On the SAT, you have two math sections, one where you're allowed to use a calculator and one where you're not. On the ACT, you are given one math section, you are allowed a calculator. And then there's an additional optional essay section on the ACT. Some kids will write it, some schools prefer to have an essay submitted. Some schools don't care. Most schools, you're already writing an application essay anyway. So to write an additional essay on top of it may be helpful for some students, but it's not necessarily something that I would recommend unless there were some kind of extenuating circumstances where it would make a difference for a student to write that essay. It's just more time spent, and it's a very difficult essay to write. It's not like anything they've ever written in school. So the schematics of it it's a lot to wrap your head around. Okay, so in terms of a little bit more of a breakdown, the SAT is big. Oh, the other big thing that is a decision maker, especially during COVID, is that the ACT is computer-based. Any student outside of the United States, no matter where you are, will write it on the computer, and it's digital. The SAT is on paper. So the sort of rush for finding seats to write the SAT over the past couple of years has been chaos. I don't want to sugarcoat it. I've had students that I've worked with who have gone as far as Thunder Bay to write an SAT because there have been no other places for them to write. And that's a pretty unique circumstance. It's more happened that I've had kids even go as far as Windsor to write an SAT. Some kids will go up near Sudbury. It's really just a matter of finding a seat at an actual, usually in a gymnasium at a school where you can sit down and write this test. The ACT is administered in a testing center. So they share those centers with a lot of other online accreditation testing. So like if you're going to get your nursing exam and things like that, you would go to a testing location where there's cubicles and you would sit down in front of a computer and write your tests there. In terms of like smaller differences, there's more reading comp questions on the SAT and fewer on the ACT. And then, on the ACT, there's some math that you would not necessarily see on the SAT, just like probability and statistics. You would not see that on the SAT in most cases. Okay, so what's a good score? The other good question, or the other big question that a lot of people will ask. So it really depends on the school that you're looking at. The maximum score on the ACT is a 36. The maximum score on the SAT is a 1600. So that's just like a weird scaled score. Both of them are just scaled scores. Like what the ACT is scaled down to 36, the SAT is scaled way up to 1600. The average score is 21 on the ACT, 1070 on the SAT. If you're looking at going to a school, like I always give the example, like I have a brother who lives in Indiana now. He moved out there for a job. And so like I give the example of like the schools out there because I've done a little bit of research since I have a nephew out there now too. So like I sort of just like want to get a lay of the land, and most of those schools around there, if you presented them with a 1070 on your SAT, they'd be more than happy to consider you as an applicant. If you're looking at an Ivy League school, and in no universe would a 1070 get you anywhere. A 1520 is sort of a decent score for most of the Ivy League schools, but you're in, I don't know what the expression I'm looking for is, but it's much more difficult in terms of the playing field and the people that you're up against. The higher the score that you can get, the much better chance that you have. And really the only chance that you have, is scoring above a 1450, I would say at the bare minimum, or a 34 on the ACT. And to get those kinds of scores, intelligence alone and doing well in school, that will certainly help you on your way. But there's a really big portion of questions on these tests that are beyond, just sort of general ability in terms of what a good student would be able to do, but really there is a suite of knowledge, particularly with the grammar section in English and some of the reading comprehension sort of abilities that go way beyond what kids are actually normally doing. There's a link here that I will include in the follow-up email that goes out after this, just to say thanks. But that link here is I forget what the acronym is, the NCES, the National Center for Educational Statistics, I think. And their College Navigator section on their site will actually give you, for most schools in the US, there's obviously some tiny schools that don't have this kind of, these stats, but it'll give you a breakdown of the mean SAT or ACT score for the schools that you're looking at. If it doesn't give you both, you can basically compare them as being one and the same in terms of like the equivalent score on the other test. But if you have a school in mind or a few schools in mind, knowing what kinds of scores most of the kids who are being accepted are receiving is really good to know in terms of what your goal is. Okay, so again, I didn't want to get too much, but I'll talk about it. The ACT in terms of the math, the ACT and the SAT in terms of the math, 2/3 of it is algebra. There's a lot of tricky questions. There's a lot of trick answer choices where, if you do the first part of the question, you'll see that answer choice listed. And if you're rushing, you'll think, oh, good, I solved it. I see 51, boom, I'm good to go. Where like you haven't read the whole question and actually realized that there's an additional thing that you need to do. The other thing that's really important to know about the SAT is the grid-in section, which is just a nightmare for most kids to learn how to do. It looks like this. So instead of choosing answer choice B, for certain questions, you will have to write in that you have found that the answer is 2.13, and you'll pencil in 2 on the first column, and then the point on the second, and then 2, 3 on the third and fourth, respectively. And also write those digits in the boxes above. And if you mess up on any of those 8 things, you get the answer choice wrong or the answer wrong. So it's just an additional headache to work through on the SAT. That I don't know why they do these. It's honestly just sort of a headache, like I said. Okay, in terms of the reading, they're dense, challenging readings. Most of it has to do with recognizing sort of the general things that kids would be asked about with reading comprehension. What's the main idea? Give me some supporting evidence. What does this word mean? But the way that the passages are actually put together and the time that you have to actually answer these questions makes this section particularly challenging. And I'll give you some examples of questions in a minute. On the writing section, so this is not the essay. This is the language, the English section on the ACT and the writing and language section on the SAT. They're looking at English grammar. You are playing the role of an editor. So you need to look at sentence structure, punctuation, concision, diction. There are explicit grammar rules that are being taught. So an example that will happen is they'll say, here's a sentence with a semicolon in it, and the semicolon will be underlined. And your answer choices are A, leave the semicolon, B, use a comma, C, use a colon, or D, use a hyphen or a dash. And to know which one of those is correct, a lot of, sort of native English speakers will be able to figure certain things out, but to know those explicit grammar rules, you either know them or you don't. And then the ACT science, I already sort of went over, it's mostly reading comprehension. You do have to know a little bit about the scientific method and some math. There's a tiny bit of outside knowledge that you might need, but not always. Okay, so test time. Here is a math question. This is normally late grade 9, early grade 10 math. By the time you're writing this test at the end of grade 11 or early grade 12, you may have forgotten how to actually solve this. And solving for y in a system of equations, it does involve a little bit of mental work, and you need to make sure that you're following what you're doing. So, this may be easy for some students. This may be challenging for other students, depending on where you are with your math and what you've recently reviewed. A reading section. So this is sort of a short snippet of a reading section. You would obviously be given more questions than just one, and it would be a longer passage than this. But you're given something to read, and then you're being asked what the primary purpose of the passage is. And normally what will happen is at least 3 of those 4 choices will sound really enticing and will really sound like that could probably be the answer. So, understanding some of the tricks about, looking at the action words within the answer choices, looking at, understanding or predicting what the main idea is in your head before you look at the answer choices. There's some small things that can really help you with this, but practice is really, what makes a big difference. For the writing section. So again, I mentioned punctuation before. It's my favorite thing to complain about on the writing section. So here it is: air travel period. That is until the Hindenburg disaster. Which one of these is the right way to go? So again, understanding how punctuation works, that a full stop would not would not be appropriate for what comes next, which is a fragment, or that is until the Hindenburg disaster is can't stand on its own. It's late. It's a late on a Thursday. My grammar my grammar lingo is taking a little bit of a break. So yeah, I mean, just knowing those the sort of ins and outs of those things is extremely important for this. And this is a pretty common question type that you would see on this test. And then finally, the science section. Here's a table that you're given with names of waves and the types of gamma rays and electromagnetic spectrum, sort of the frequency and wavelength and that kind of thing. And then you're just being asked to make a comparison between the relationship of the frequency to the radar. So again, just interpreting what's happening here. One thing that is notable in terms of understanding is understanding exponent laws, particularly with negative exponents, and just being able to work comfortably with those in order to answer these kinds of questions. And then the essay, again, there's no longer an SAT essay, but for the ACT, students who are taking the essay will stay at the end when other people leave. And you're basically looking at 3 issues, reflecting on the perspectives that are given to you on this issue, providing your own perspective, and then relating them to one another. It's more familiar of a format than the SAT essay was, but it's still an unfamiliar format for most students. Okay. So let's talk about actually understanding what we're doing here. You do need to know content skills. You do need to learn content in math and grammar, but the strategies are really what's going to make a difference to most kids. You can only learn a certain number of hard skills of the hundreds of individual skills that are looked at on this test, but understanding how to work through questions that you're not sure about is really key here. So time management is number 1. This is a very tricky test in terms of timing. Both of them are. Looking at cues from the wording of the questions and the answer choices, knowing how to use the elimination strategy, knowing how to substitute things into your answer to see if it works. Most of these strategies apply to both tests. So even if you're studying for the SAT and you decide that you're going to take the SAT, it won't have been for naught. You will be able to apply most of what you've learned. There will be some tweaks, and vice versa. If you were doing ACT and then you decide to take the SAT, there will be some tweaks, but most of it is actually just directly applicable. And then retests. Okay, so how do retests work? Most students take the test more than once. So in the US, let me just give a little bit of a breakdown of how the world is different in the US versus Canada. Well, I mean, there's a lot of differences, but in terms of taking the test, US, everybody by the middle of grade 11 has their SAT study book in their pile of books that they're carrying from class to class. And by the end of grade 11, so I would say by May, most students, 99% of students who are going to take the test at all will have taken the test. End of grade 11, you get your results over the summer, you send them to universities or colleges, as you say there. And then grade 12 comes along, or 12th grade, and those who did not like their scores from the end of 11th grade will retake the test and send those new scores in instead. In Canada, most kids don't even really think about applying to university until they're in grade 12. So, there's a big push generally around December, January, where a lot of the schools do this, the Common App. They sort of get kids moving on it all at once. And the application process and hearing back is a lot faster in Canada than it is in the US. But when you're a Canadian applying to a US school, there's a lot to consider, especially if your kid is not an American citizen. So there's the visa process. There's applying as an international student. There's more things that come into play. So I do advise any family who's looking at going to the US to be, ahead of the game. By the end of grade 11, you have to be ready to, to commit to taking this test and be willing to, get ready to start sending those scores to schools. Okay, so some colleges require all of your scores to be submitted. So if you take the test 5 times, some colleges will say, we want all of those scores. Some colleges will, or universities, I should say, I'm speaking American again. Some universities will allow you to choose the scores that you want submitted. So I only want test 1 to be sent in because test 2 wasn't as good. And ACT allows for super scoring. So super scoring has changed a little bit in the past year, but generally what super scoring means is that you're able to select certain scores from certain tests and have those scores sent in. So if you do better on your writing test on one test and better on your math on another test, you can super score and combine those two better scores and send them in. They have made some changes on it, and it sounds like they may be moving away from being so open about letting people decide which ones they want to choose. In some cases, what they've already started to do is average scores. Individual schools have started to do that, but that may be something that the ACT ends up doing themselves anyway, so that you're no longer allowed to say, I scored perfect on this one and terribly on this one, and I'm going to send my perfect score in. It would actually reflect an average of those two scores. Most students improve on their second test. The first test is oftentimes, a trial run. Even if you've prepped for 6 months or a year, sitting down and doing the real test is a very different reality than doing practice and feeling safe in terms of, knowing that there's no dire consequences for it. So most students do improve on their second test, and it is generally advised for students to do more than one test. Doing 3 tests is, that's an individual decision based on, I guess, what kind of improvement could be made on a third test. For some families, I would say, unless you're going to commit to 3 solid months of regular preparation and really hit the books here, doing an additional test may not do much. Okay. And let's see, prepping. Okay, so how does preparation work? So basically the preparation process, in terms of how we do things at least, is to start with a simulated practice test. And that's a fully timed test for one of the ACT or the SAT. And students will go in blind. I mean, like, no preparation needed from the beginning. This is just for us as teachers to understand where your student is or where your child is. So we don't necessarily want to see that they, lucked out and answered 5 questions correctly out of 35. Basically what I'm saying is, like, we just want kids to show exactly what they know. So guessing is not encouraged on that simulated practice test. We really just want to see, what do we need to teach you? So that's our baseline. What are we actually working with here? For some students, it's absolutely everything on the test. For some students, it's 75% of what's on the test. And for a very rare group of students, it's 50% or less. And I know that sounds daunting, because by the end of grade 11, if this is an aptitude test, they should be able to prove that they've learned what they should have learned based on this aptitude test. But there's obviously a disconnect between a private organization, the SAT or the College Board, and public education, districts and government organizations. So what the College Board, the makers of the SAT, decide grade 11 students should know across the country is very different from what students are learning at the end of grade 11 in California versus Alabama versus Massachusetts. And obviously, not even to get into Ontario, not that there's, anything wrong with the Ontario school system necessarily. Well, there's problems with all kinds of school systems. I take that back, but there's nothing that would, that would make it more challenging for a student in Ontario versus a student in New York, except for maybe just some general feeling of, knowledge of the United States, but you wouldn't really need any knowledge of outside anything on this test. But if you got a section on Benjamin Franklin, you might feel more comfortable as an American student with some background knowledge. Okay, I'm rambling. We set achievable goals. So by the end of 6 weeks, we're going to move you up to a 1200 from an 1100. That doesn't sound like a huge improvement, but moving up that number of points is actually, it's a triumph. And it means that what they're learning is being internalized, and they're practicing it again when they do a test. We're doing a lot of content exercises. There are many, many, many books available of SAT tests, but there's only a few official SAT tests that are out there, and they are out there, and they need to be used because nobody can make an SAT test like the College Board makes their own SAT test. So when you buy other books, and we have a book coming out as well where we're making practice sections, and I'll be the first to say that our practice sections are not being written by SAT by College Board employees, so they won't be of exactly the same caliber. So those tests are precious in terms of actually using them and learning from them. Progress is different for everybody. For some kids, moving up 50 points is a huge triumph. For some kids, it comes a little bit easier. But as you all know, as parents, students learn at different rates, and they learn in different ways. So starting early is best. And even if that's just to do the first practice test to see what the baseline is, starting early and making sure that we know what's ahead of us is really key to this. Okay, so registering for the test, sort of just a quick thing about it. You should do it by the spring of grade 11. Most of the time you can register as late as 1 month in advance. So after that 1 month mark, registration is closed. Accommodations are available. If your child gets accommodations in school for anything, extra time on a test, use of a scribe, quiet space to write in, anything, apply for your accommodations, do it early. So I can talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Schools will not be made aware of accommodations if you're applying to Cornell and your student gets a scribe on the test. Cornell is not going to see that your child got a scribe while they were writing the test. They will just get that score, and that's all they'll see. So use those accommodations. There is nothing wrong with getting accommodations on this test. You should get them if your child is getting them in school. All you need is somebody in your school to say, I am a resource person or a guidance counselor, and I can attest to the fact that this child gets this accommodation. Okay, so what's it all worth? Grades are most important. End of story for every single school. If you have a great report card, that is the most important thing. For a school that takes tests, test scores are next. So if you have a great report card and a decent SAT score or ACT score, it doesn't mean the same thing as a student with both, with a good score on both. Extracurriculars come last, but athletics can take first place, which of course is the world we live in. So some of you may have kids who are already involved in premier athletics where they've already been scouted by coaches in the US, and it happens quite often. So if that's the case for you, know that athletics can take first place. So I shouldn't say they always do, they can, because people who are already in the school have an in. So a coach has a way of working with the school to make sure that they get the kid that they want. But really, there's no free pass. It's not that if you are just an amazing basketball player with terrible grades that you can somehow get into, play at UPenn. It's not going to happen. Could you play at a smaller state school for 4 years and then move on to a higher ed degree? Maybe. But it's not a guarantee. So yes, like the report card is number one, even if you're the most amazing athlete that the world has ever seen. And you do want those test scores to be high as well if you're applying to a school that requires them, or even a school that's test optional, like I said at the beginning. And then the application essay is obviously something that's important as well. That's just your one chance to show your true self, especially if you're doing the SAT and or not doing the essay on the ACT. This is the one chance to be more than your numbers. So, if you have 2 kids who have the exact same SAT score and the exact same report cards, and one of them has just a stellar application essay and the other one is mediocre, it's an easy choice for schools. So it's a tiebreaker. Okay, so to wrap up, both tests are hard. Early preparation is required or important. It's really important to target an individual student's weakness and practice them regularly. Academic excellence does not always translate to high test scores. Actually, I would say it often doesn't, and you should plan to take the test multiple times. So I will open the floor to questions. Let me quickly personally wrap up. So I am the test prep director at Ruth Max Learning Space. I do see some students myself, other teachers on staff also see other students, but we are a group of trained educators. So we have teaching degrees from various other states or provinces. So I have mine from Ontario, even though I grew up in the US. Actually, I'm sorry, I got my first teaching degree in Quebec, and then I translated it when I came to Ontario and did my master's. But I am OCT. So everybody on staff is a teacher, and we're really looking at this as helping students in a way that we've always wanted to help students, which is with academic success. So this is not necessarily, somebody who's just good at taking a test, helping to take a test. So that being said, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, free of, conditions of working with us. If you have questions about how hard the test is or what individual accommodations look like, or, where to actually take the test or anything like that, I'm more than happy to get an email from you. And, I can certainly respond with some information or some resources, as quickly as I can, usually within a couple of days. if you have some questions about what preparation looks like and, how to get started with preparation, I'm obviously also happy to help with that. There will be an email that you receive likely tomorrow morning with a link to do a diagnostic test. So if you'd like to do that first test, like I mentioned before, you can simply click on that link, and there is a fee involved with it because there is a full analysis that we'll do for it before we send it back to you. So there's a personalized analysis. It's usually a couple of pages long that really details what kinds of things need to be worked on. So you can purchase that directly through our site, and we'll send you a link to do the test online. But again, if anybody has any other questions about anything that I mentioned, including the test optional situation, please feel free to type in either the chat window, or there should be a Q&A box, although after 2 years of teaching online, I still don't know how to use Zoom properly, so I don't see the Q&A box. Here it is. Okay, so if you don't have any questions, please feel free to be on your merry way this evening. And if you would like to stick around in hopes that other people do have questions, feel free to do that as well. Okay, so great. So I have a few questions here. So first question, would you recommend to take the PSAT at grade 10? So at the beginning, I did mention quickly the PSAT. If your goal, your ultimate goal is to take the SAT, there's no reason to take the PSAT. The PSAT, if your student is an American citizen and they want to take the PSAT because they're applying for a scholarship, if it's the National Merit Scholarship, unless they live in a US state, it's not going to matter if they take the PSAT, they won't qualify for it. If it's a private scholarship that asks for a PSAT score, then yeah, take it. But prepping for one is prepping for both. So it's not that if you prepare for the PSAT, then you'll have to prepare again for the SAT. Preparing for the PSAT means that you're starting to prepare for the SAT. The SAT is just longer. It's not harder necessarily. I mean, there may be a few math questions on the SAT that you don't see on the PSAT, but the PSAT is harder then, I guess, because students are less prepared at grade 10 than they are in grade 11. So if you want to do it as practice, do it as practice. The other reason that you would take it in Canada, and I was going to get back to this before I forgot, is if you've already been poached by an athletics sort of a coach or somebody like that at a school who says, give me your PSAT score and I'm going to use it as a placeholder. So I just want to see that you're able to do it so that I can say to the school, hey, this kid did this on the PSAT. They'll be able to do this on the SAT when they do it next year. Those are really the only two reasons that you would take the PSAT in Canada. In the States, there would be other reasons, mostly because of just the nature of standardized testing in the States, and it's sort of like part of the journey, but it's not necessarily required. I would say the better thing to do would be to start with SAT preparation and just start taking practice SATs. Not pre-SATs, not PSATs, but start practicing with SAT tests. Okay, I hope that helps. Ask again if that wasn't clear. Do all US schools require an SAT? No, not at all. So there are more schools than ever, especially this year, that don't require an SAT or an ACT score. Those schools, so I mentioned University of California schools a few times. UC does not require SAT or ACT at all anymore. They've done away with it. So they are test blind. There are other schools that are test optional, which again, just to reiterate, is works in their favor in a lot of ways to seem a little bit more equitable, but actually boosts their exclusivity rate in terms of being able to turn away more students than they had before, because more students apply than would have in the past. So yeah, a school like like UPenn, like I said, many students would just say like, there's no dream of me ever getting into UPenn. But if a school like that goes test optional, that student might say, hey, like my SAT score isn't going to matter now, so I can apply. So there are more people applying to those schools, but still the same number of seats. And they're still only going to accept the students at the very top of the tier. Any student who has a straight A or A+ report card wouldn't hesitate necessarily to take the SAT anyway, because they're spreading their seeds widely to many of the top schools in the US, many of which still require the SAT. So they would send their score in anyway because it looks good to have a really high score. So no, they don't all require it, but especially as an international student, it shows that you are able to sort of compete with the Americanism. And there is a really, there is a mentality of the US is number one all across the United States, you know, even in sort of the most open-minded sort of places. Like I said, I grew up in sort of Metro New York. So like, you know, I can speak for the New York metro area in also having that mindset of like, if you're not from here, then your reality of education is just not quite at the same caliber. So it's an unfortunate mentality, but it means that when you're applying to those schools, you do need to show that you have what it takes to compete in an American environment. And what that comes down to oftentimes is showing that you've really rocked one of their standardized tests. An IB degree will often have some sway, but usually not the same way, because the IB system is not something that really exists to the same caliber in the United States, because it's insular, right? Most Americans don't leave the United States to go somewhere else. You provide a counseling service or educational consultation to guide a student as to his or her options in terms of US universities. So anecdotally, yes, we will say, you know, hey, this might be a really good school for you. We should look at it. The United States is, it's mind numbing, the number of universities there are in the United States. So I don't purport to be an expert on that, nor does anybody else on staff, but we do work very closely with other individuals and organizations who are amazing at sort of navigating through that world. Those people have waiting lists. So if you are looking at getting that done, I will publicly say right now, Colleen Reed at American University Counseling, Colleen Reed, she is like my go-to person to recommend people to. Her family runs this business, so her husband also does it, and her kids are involved in a lot of the parts of the business too. So it's really wonderful to support a local Toronto business, and they're wonderful people. They spend tons of time at universities in the US, getting to know the admissions people, getting to know the culture. So they're great people to go to. That would be my number one to go to. So, but yeah, like anecdotally, I can say like, you know, this is not, this is maybe not the right thing to look at, or, you know, this might be a better school. But, you know, in terms of who I would recommend, that would certainly be number one. I can also, make another suggestion. Ingenius is an organization. I'm spelling their name wrong. Ingenius. Let me get their email from my email. I'll find somebody that's emailed me. Ingenius Prep. So Ingenius Prep is an organization with less of a wait list. It's a bigger organization. I do obviously prefer, you know, like I work for a very small company, Ruth Max Learning Space. I do prefer working with other people who are like, you know, more down to earth and like have more power within their organization. But Ingenius is definitely, you know, a bigger organization that knows a lot about the schools as well. And they actually only hire the people who work with students on admissions prep are people who have been admissions officers at US universities. So that's a pretty cool thing to have as well. And are you all now looking at my screen? Sorry. If you were all just looking at my Gmail screen and Gchats. But yeah, so I hope that answers that question. I did in the chat put those to Colleen Reed from American University Counseling and Ingenius Prep, just for your reference if you'd like those. I will also just put in the National Center for Educational Statistics link that I put before, although it has the wrong, actual link on it. Like the section that it leads to is Nation's Report Card rather than College Navigator. Okay. Okay, so if you are unable to see the chat, I thought I sent it to hosts and participants. What I can do is, can anybody give me a thumbs up over their name if they are able to see what I've put in the chat? just so I know if it's everybody or just individual people who are unable to see it. I have a frowny face, so that's bad news. So I guess I guess it's more people who can't see it. It's not in chat. Okay, so it's everybody. Amazing. Zoom is. I'm a good teacher. I promise you that. Zoom is just not working for me. It may be okay. You know what I'm going to do is I'll put those things in. I'll put those things in the presentation right now. Calling read and Ingenius Prep. And I will reshare my screen. There you go. Okay, now everybody should be able to see it. And we're back. So sorry about that. It's always something, internet woes. So as I got cut off, I was going to say, if you would like to book a diagnostic test, there will be a link in the email that goes out to you tomorrow. If there were any questions that went in or comments while my internet got cut out, I am not sure what the same question that you have is being referred to, because my internet cut for a second and I didn't see whatever question came in. How long does the average student need to prep? Oh, okay, cool. So it really depends on the student. I would say the minimum is about 3 months. And that would be like 3 months of usually twice a week, 2 hours a week of actual prep and work on their own. So I would say, like, in terms of working with a teacher, 2 hours a week for 3 months is about average. And then doing about 3 or 4 hours of homework on top of that per week, just to practice what they're learning is, really generally what's required. Again, it's not necessarily that they need to learn new content. It's that they need to be familiar with the test to the extent that when they go in and write that test, they sit down and open the writing and language section and say, okay, this is a direct evidence question. And I know that there's paired, or that's the reading test. There's a direct evidence question. And I know that this is a paired question where I can use the following questions, answer choices to apply to this answer. And like, knowing that is going to save you so much time. Knowing it is one thing, but automatically applying it is a very different thing. And that's what really takes a lot of practice, is just knowing, okay, when I see this, this is what I do, and I can move on. But also knowing, like, hey, I got to a question that's asking me that it's a direct evidence question and it's not linked to any other information, which means that I have to scour this entire passage to try to find the answer. So what I'm going to do is leave it blank and come back to it at the end. And like that, those are the kinds of strategies that don't come naturally to students. And in fact, most students have never done a test where they're not just asked to start with question 1 and go to the end. Some teachers will be like, yeah, if you have essay questions, you do those first and then you go to multiple choice. But these 2 tests, SAT and ACT, individually have very, very specific strategies that oftentimes require unlearning from what kids have done in school for 12 years or 11 years, and then relearning a new strategy just for this. So 3 months is average. I would say some kids a full year of prep, and that's not 2 times a week, 5 hours a week, whatever, for an entire year. It means starting with a book and meeting with somebody a couple of times, taking the summer off and doing some practice, meeting with some, somebody a couple more times in the fall. Like, it's sort of, it depends on the individual student and how, and what they're actually looking for, and what their baseline is and what their learning is. Do you need scores for UK schools? No. SAT and ACT are only for the United States. You can obviously send most schools anything that you want them to see. If you want them to see, hey, my kid did the SAT and got a 1550 out of 1600, it certainly wouldn't hurt, a school like Oxford. But they have their own, the UK has a very different system with education than most North American schools, or Canadian and American schools, not necessarily, other places in North America, Mexico, and other countries are a little bit different. But yeah, in terms of the UK, there are other things that they'll need to do. I'm not the most qualified to speak on those things. They will often have to do equivalency tests and things like that, but no, they won't need to submit these scores. Okay. So I'll wait a few more minutes in case there are any more questions. So this does go to 8. I'm happy to answer anything else that may come in. I am going to turn off my mic for a minute, just in terms of, or just in, I have dogs, and it's getting to be the time where they will start barking at people in the neighborhood, coming and going at night. So I'll just preemptively mute myself in case, but yes, I'll unmute myself if there are any other questions. If there are no other questions, thank you very much for being here. It's always a pleasure to have people who are curious about this kind of thing. And again, I'm happy to help with any other questions that you may have, or any individual things, or helping your kid to prepare. So thank you.